it's art time! I'm so glad you're here. Welcome back. Today we're continuing our watercolor series and we're going to cover 3 different basic watercolor textures. On the screen you'll see our list of supplies that we need today. Please make sure that one of your brushes remains dry. Do not put it in the water quite yet. In case you haven't seen them already, we also have an Introduction to Watercolor series and basic watercolor techniques. We'll link those videos here for you. Once you've seen those and you're all caught up and ready for texture, welcome back. Alright, so now that you've got your supplies set up, let's go ahead and get started. Again, today we're going to be covering 3 basic texture techniques. We're going to build on the previous video, so if you haven't seen that, you can click here, and let's go ahead and get started. For our first texture, alright, so we're going to start by dividing our paper into 3 sections. Again, I'm working with a smaller sheet of paper today. You don't need a full size for this exercise. I will be posting another video with our first 3 basic techniques and these texture techniques. But in case you just need the texture, you're in the right spot. So we're going to take our paper and divide it, like I said, into 3 sections because we're going to learn 3 new techniques today. Again, does not need to be perfect and they don't need to be perfectly equal. Our first technique that we are going to do together, we're going to be using a paper towel to create some texture. There's a million different things you can call this technique. When I first started teaching in the early days, I would call it dabbing, but that was the same time that the dab motion was really popular and I couldn't say it without all of my students breaking into the dab and getting very distracted. So I moved on to calling it a towel texture. You can call it whatever you want. So I'm going to write down towel / dab texture. I'm just going to write text because I don't know if maybe I can fit texture. Okay. So, for our first technique, we are going to want to start with a dark, wet wash. So again, we're going to start with a wet brush. Did I say wet brush or dry brush? Wet brush. I wouldn't wipe off too much of the water because you're going to need it for this technique. I'm going to choose a darker color and I need it, again, really dark, really wet. So I'm going to start by swirling it 5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, and so this is still pretty light. We want it to be kind of dark and wet, so I'm gonna swirl it a couple more times. Again, my paint is really dry, so I'm gonna need some extra water here to bring it to life. There we go. So what we're looking for here, you'll know you're in the right spot. If you tilt your paper, do you all see how it's shiny? That's kind of what we're looking for. So you want it to be nice and dark, nice and wet. We're going to be taking a paper towel and kind of crumbling it up. If your paper towels are super, super, super absorbent, it might not work really, really well. So sometimes the cheaper stuff works better here. But you're just going to kind of crumble this up and we're going to dab this. We're going straight down and straight up. So different towels can get you different techniques, different textures, but what you're going to see is it's going to start to absorb and pull out some of that pigment. What you don't want to do is I've had some students dab it too many times, or you do not want to kind of swirl it. If you do that, you're going to ruin the effect here. So if you did that, if you're like me and you're like, oops, too much, I don't have any changes or differentiation here, we can just try again. So if you do that, if you make a mistake, that's okay, we're going to try again. We're going to again start with a wet brush, load it up. Oh, there we go, we got lots of pigment here. Water that down just a smidge. Again, I'm just going to keep adding till I have a nice dark wet surface. See the light bouncing off, and you're going to take, again, your crumbled up towel, and we're just going to dab it a couple times till you get some changes in your texture. So go ahead, give that a try, and I'll be here waiting when you're done. Awesome. For our next technique, we are going to be using salt to make a texture. So I just like to call this salt texture. So for this technique, So we're going to be using salt for this technique. And what I didn't realize until I started teaching that is different kinds of salts will give you different effects. So that's pretty cool. Here today, I'm working with kosher salt. That one's my personal favorite because the grains are a little bit bigger. The technique at the end, once it's dry, is going to be a little clearer because your grains are bigger to work with. So what's going to happen here is we are going to put down a really dark, really wet wash. If your wash is not wet enough, you're not going to be able to see this technique when it's done. So I'll show you what to look for. We're going to end up sprinkling some salt on top. And the hardest part of this technique, y'all, is just waiting for it to dry. You will not get to see the final results until the whole thing is dry. So I know once your salt's down, you're going to want to mess with it. Please don't. Just let it do its thing. It's going to absorb the water and push away the pigment. And when it dries, it's going to look like cute little snowflakes. So we're going to start, like I said, with a really dark, wet wash. So I'm going to start with, again, a really wet brush. I'm just going to barely take the water off. And I'm just going to, why not use purple again? So I'm going to swirl. I'm going to start with 5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ooh, and right here you can see I've got way too much pigment. See how dark that is? So good news is we have some water here. We can water this down. But I do like that it's dark enough. We're going to see some contrast here. So for this one, here's what we're looking for, friends. Again, we're going to see if it's shiny. So when you tilt, see how this one has the light bouncing off it and this one doesn't? This would be too dry. It wouldn't work. This one is wet enough because you can see the light. The other thing we're going to look for is when I tilt it, do y'all see how my pigment is starting to run here? Can you see that? I'm going to tilt it another way. So when you tilt your paper, you want to have so much pigment in here that when you tilt it, you can start to see that pigment running. That's what we're looking for. So you need, again, a darker color and you need enough water and enough pigment that you can see the light bounce off it and you can see it run. Once you're in a good spot, you're going to take just a pinch of salt and lay that down. And I'll see if I can get you a close-up here so you can actually see what's happening. So as you can see, it's already started to change color. You can see our salt is starting to absorb the water and it's pushing away the pigment. And again, the hardest part, I think, honestly, of this technique is just not messing with it till it's done. So once that's on there, we're just going to kind of let it do its thing. Once it's dry, you can scrape that salt off and it'll leave behind a really fun, it almost looks like little crystals or little snowflakes. Go ahead and give that a try. All right, for our last technique, this one is my favorite. So we are going to be using rubbing alcohol. So this is, I tell my students, this is the same stuff where, like, you know, you might fall and get a cut or something and, you know, you go to the nurse to clean it off and this stuff does sting. It doesn't feel great, but it is used as a first aid antiseptic. So I always tell my students this is not drinking alcohol because they always ask. This is rubbing alcohol or isopropyl alcohol. Totally different thing. The higher your percentage, the more striking your effect is going to be. I usually stick with 70 or higher, which I think is pretty standard. So what I do is I squeeze a little bit of this out into a container. And this is probably one of my favorite techniques. Things you need to know before doing this is rubbing alcohol has a really strong reaction with watercolor, which is really awesome, but it can also be dangerous. So especially if you are doing this set of techniques with kids, like I used to use these with my middle school students, please make sure you explain to them the lid needs to stay on at all times until you're ready to use it. And then as soon as you're done using it, put that lid right back on. Because if you spill this on someone's painting or your own, you will ruin the painting. The other thing to keep in mind when you're using this is I like to use a dry brush. The reason is because if you have a brush that's loaded up with water and you put it in here, it's going to water down your rubbing alcohol and then the effect isn't going to be as strong or it might not show up. I like to use an angle brush with this and I'll show you why, is because you can kind of get some splatter effects with this if you do it the right way. And you can also kind of dab it and get the effects too. So, oh, I forgot to even label. So here we're going to use a rubbing alcohol technique. All right, so let's just change it up a little bit. We're gonna, again, do a super dark, super wet wash. You could even, if you really want to get fancy here. Ooh, and that's a lot of pigment. So now my paint is nice and soaking wet, so my pigment's coming out easier, so I need to water this down. There we go. And if you really want to get fancy, you could even do a wet on wet here and combine with different colors. Why not? That looks nice, huh? Okay. All right, so again, let's check ourselves. Same as before, we want a really wet wash so I can see the light bounce off it. If I tilt this, you can see my pigment is running, right? So that's what we're looking for. Once you've got yourself set up, I'm gonna take my little rubbing alcohol container here. I'm gonna take my brush. Okay, and there's two ways you can do this. One way is to hold the brush like this, if you can see that, with the long side of the angle facing you and the short side facing the painting, and you can take this and pull, and you'll see how it leaves behind an effect. If that's not working or it's not striking enough for you, you can just take this and kind of poke and check that out. Isn't that fun? This is my favorite. All right, so go ahead. Again, if your wash is too dry, this technique will not work. So if you try it, it's not doing anything for you, it means you need a little more pigment, a little more water. So go ahead and give that a try. Awesome. I hope you've enjoyed these 3 techniques, and hopefully these fun textures will help kind of spruce up your paintings. Coming soon, I will release a video as well with our 3 basic techniques plus our 3 texture techniques. So enjoy, have fun, keep creating, and until next time, I'll see you then. Bye, everybody.